Now, NHS England have confirmed that children will no longer routinely be prescribed puberty blockers at gender identity clinics. The decision comes after a review found there was not enough evidence that they are safe or effective. Puberty blockers, which pause the physical changes of puberty, will now only be available as part of research. Fewer than 100 young people in England are currently prescribed these kinds of drugs by the NHS. The BBC's LGBT and identity reporter is Josh Parry. Morning, Josh.
Good morning, Rachel.
Can you just explain a bit more about what puberty blockers are and what this new policy means?
Yeah, so puberty blockers, also known as puberty suppressing hormones, do exactly that, really. They're synthetic hormones that suppress puberty, and they're often used and prescribed to children with gender-related distress in order to stop some of those physical changes that happen during puberty. So things like the development of breasts or facial hair, and they're often seen as a way of pausing that puberty while children, their families, and clinicians consider how to approach their gender identity, which could, in some cases, mean things like cross-sex hormones or physical surgeries. Their use for children, though, has come under scrutiny in recent years, and NHS England had introduced a sort of interim policy of only prescribing puberty blockers to children as part of clinical research. And they also commissioned a review to look at how much evidence there was for blockers. That review has found that they didn't really have enough evidence to prove they're safe or effective. And there were also concerns raised about how they may affect things like bone density for those children who are prescribed them. This announcement, which came quite late yesterday, is essentially the NHS England saying that in England they're going to be introducing this policy permanently, and that moving forward, puberty blockers will no longer routinely be prescribed for children. Those already on puberty blockers, though, which, as you said earlier, we understand to be less than 100 children, will be able to continue to take them.
Because as I understand it, these drugs were never approved for use in these kinds of situations. That wasn't their initial intention, although, as is often the case around medication, healthcare, you find that there are further uses for certain drugs, don't you, than what they're originally intended for. But there is this separate wider review into how gender-distressed children are treated, isn't there?
Yeah, so as you say, this is for many, this is a fairly new area of medicine and particularly around children. And there has been a number of different reviews going on all at the same time. So it can be a little bit confusing to those who are kind of outside of this realm. But as well as that review of evidence I mentioned earlier from NHS England, there's been a separate, more wide-ranging review, which is led by paediatrician Dr. Hilary Cass, and that's known as the Cass Review. And that's been taking place for a number of years now, and it's looking at how gender identity services are run in England. We are expecting that full report in the next few weeks, but this latest announcement gives us some idea of what this report is likely to say. It's obviously an extremely controversial subject, and it concerns the health and well-being of children. So back in 2022, Dr. Cass released an interim report to give an update on the progress and to make some recommendations. And as you mentioned, this was never licensed for children in this way. And so that her interim report found that in these cases, there was a gap in evidence about the safety and effectiveness of puberty blockers. And it called for a big transformation in the way that gender identity is approached for children in England.
And then tell us the context in which this announcement has been made in terms of how NHS England are planning to reform the way gender identity support is provided.
So all of these reviews and these new policies are all interlinked, really. There are big changes underway as to how gender identity services operate in England. Some of those changes we know about, this new policy, for instance, the Cass interim report, for example, but others we don't have full detail of. But as I said, yesterday's announcement perhaps does suggest some direction of movement to a more cautious approach. England's only specialist service for young people, which is a gender identity development service, or better known as GIDS, is set to close at the end of this month after it was rated inadequate by inspectors back in 2020. And it all comes really after referrals for this service grew over a decade. So in a 10-year period, it went from around 250 referrals a year to more than 5,000 a year. And the Cass interim report, which is that independent report which I mentioned earlier, said that this was unsustainable, and it said a more holistic service which looks at other things that might be happening in patients' lives for example, autism diagnoses, or whether they are struggling with their sexuality, or whether there are other things going on in their life, sort of some comorbidities perhaps. And it said it needed a more holistic approach that looked at all that. GID is set to be replaced by a series of regional centres over the next 2 years. The first two will be in London and Liverpool and are expected to open at the beginning of April, but will only initially take 250 patients. And the NHS England are hoping that over the next 2 years, the new centres can help make a dent in that waiting list, which is at more than 5,000 a year. And patients have been given some details on those services, and we're awaiting more details to be unveiled in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that is worth bearing in mind, 5,000 on the waiting list. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of scale of the issue that the NHS is facing in terms of offering proper treatment and support to these children and families. Thank you, Josh. Josh Parry, who is our LGBT and identity reporter. We're going to hear from a trans woman a bit later on in the programme who'll explain what this decision might mean for the trans community in general. It's worth just reading a bit of what John Stewart, who's the National Director of Specialised Commissioning at NHS England, says about this. He says the debate is often very polarised, and so too were the responses to the consultation. Many people said the policy didn't go far enough in terms of still allowing potential access to puberty blockers through research. Others saying clearly they disagreed fundamentally, and these should be routinely available to everyone who believes they need it. So in recognition of that very polarised debate and highly sensitive, we will, of course, invite you to share your views on all of this. But we are aware that it is something that people disagree very fundamentally on in many situations. So let's just read you a couple. Just this one here, I'm really pleased you're talking about this. The subject needs wider coverage from mainstream media.
One here, 17 is too young. Don't think they should be available full stop. To make a discussion of such magnitude when one's ideas are so volatile and open to undue influence is an abdication of parental responsibility.
And Rachel says it's not like these puberty blockers were just handed out like multivitamins in the first place. This appears to be a knee-jerk, politically driven decision rather than medically based. I imagine it'll just drive vulnerable people to finding blockers online. 16 minutes past 6.
Feel every moment.